Good morning.
Boy, what time is it? It's 8 a.m. What else would you be doing but coming to the Javits Center for the Book Expo America Author Breakfast? You know, it's a fine tradition, a rite of passage, if you will. Good morning. My name is Lance Fensterman. I run Book Expo America, and I'm really, really proud to wake you all up. Look at this. Wow. I said he couldn't have coffee unless he was kind to me, and I appreciate it, Craig, very much. Thank you all for getting up early and joining us today. We're delighted to have an amazing, amazing lineup of authors. And as always, we're incredibly thankful to all of our publishers that have worked with us so closely to bring this eclectic, interesting, and delightful group of authors this morning. So please, join me in welcoming to this very lectern, Mr. Craig Ferguson.
Thank you, Matt. How's that? Thanks very much. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name's Craig. I'm an alcoholic. If you're up at this time in the morning, chances are you are too. I'd like to just first of all thank you for having me here in the company of proper writers who've really got some. I mean, come on! Some of these people here. Tracy's won the Pulitzer Prize. Jeanette's book is sensational. Ben is the talk of Hollywood, and I'm here, and I haven't. I want to talk to you a little bit about my own book. I actually don't, but HarperCollins wants me to talk to you a little bit about my book. But first of all, I'd like to. I haven't read everybody on the panel's book yet. I much like everyone else in this business, I read the back of the book and go, oh, good. But I'm about 150 pages into Jeanette's book, and I have to say, it is terrific. Really, it's a sensational book, and I was worried it's really good. And after The Glass Castle, I was thinking, oh, well, so long. But no, it's really terrific. And I have to say that Jeanette's book is better than mine. It's not only is it written better, which it is, but it is it doesn't have me in it, and that improved the book enormously for me. I will say though that it looks, maybe it's an oversight, and I haven't read the entire book. There seems to be an absence of fart jokes. I don't know if the editor has taken them out or not. I know that can happen. Many of you know David Hershey, my editor at HarperCollins. He will actually add fart jokes to your book. Should you want more fart jokes in your next book, Dave's your guy. My book is a memoir about me. Apparently, I haven't read it yet, but I'm sure it's lovely. No, I wrote it. Now, the whole thing, when you write a memoir, especially after the whole James Fry thing, people get very upset because of the James Fry thing. Because, as you, of course, remember, it was a million little pieces of shit. And people get very concerned. I believe Oprah was horrified. The entire publishing community was horrified. I know I was horrified when we found out that a junkie had lied. Because if we can't trust the junkies, then, I mean, really, who can we trust? Have you ever met a junkie? Lying is what they do. I mean, when I read the book, I thought, oh, well, this is perfectly true to life. He's lying. You talk to any junkie, they will say, are you smoking crack? Like, no, it's Virginia Slim. It's my sister's. Anyway, my book is not the memoirs of a junkie. It's the memoirs of an alcoholic. So it's a completely different thing. Memoirs of a junkie, pack of lies. Memoirs of an alcoholic, made up some stuff because I can't remember what actually happened. But suffice that it's a book about coming to America in an emotional sense as well as becoming a citizen. I became a citizen in 2008, but it's also about becoming an American in a very kind of old school way, I suppose, in the sense that it was a philosophical decision. It was an idea which I subscribe to, and I subscribe to now. Certainly at the time I wrote the book, it was the end of the Bush-Cheney administration, and it seemed to me that American patriotism had been hijacked for some kind of mad parade, and I wanted to have a look at that because it didn't sit right with me. I've always loved this country a great deal, but like everyone I love, I'm not blind to their faults. And I love them because of their faults as well as, or in spite of their faults, or maybe, I don't know, it's in the book. Anyway, that's why I wrote the book. And also because I was talking earlier on, Tracy was very, very kindly, you know, asked me what Glasgow was like, the country, well, it is in a way, I suppose, a country. Glasgow is a town in Scotland that I'm from. And it's a town which, if you don't know, it's a little bit like if you imagine the movie Braveheart set in Detroit in the 1970s. It's a tough town, and I'm not so tough. I imagine if you're at the Book Expo breakfast, you're probably not that tough yourself, and so I'm sure you can empathize. Many of the people here, I'm sure, were bullied mercilessly at school. But we've all got jobs now, and fuck them. Ha ha. The truth of the matter is, I was talking to the rest of the panel backstage, and the thing that we share, they share talent. I share a kind of pushy editor and a powerful publishing house and a TV show, But what I think everybody, it's kind of awkward to talk about a book you've written, I think, because it's in the book. What I had to say is in the book. And then if I say it again, you'll think, well, he's just saying what's in the book. And I go, well, yes. But maybe I'm prejudging your judgment. And you can get ahead of yourself with that kind of thing. I've had a lot of coffee this morning. It's wearing off now, though. That's better. Okay, so what we'll do is we'll have I'm not quite sure how this works. I'm a vulgar lounge entertainer, so basically what I would probably do is just walk up and down, cuss a bit, and hope that would be okay. But I think what we do is we're going to have a panel, and these, my very esteemed dais buddies are going to talk about their works, and we'll find out about that. If I can think of a question, I might ask it, you know, to throw them off and try and make myself look good. That's kind of what we do here. And I think that's it. The only thing else I would say to you is, at the end, now it would be very important to say this, everybody kept saying, tell them at the end you're going to be at the booth. I don't know what the booth is, but I'm going to be there. And, you know, I'll be at the booth. Don't you dare try and talk to me until I'm at the booth. Because apparently that's a huge, someone will tackle you. And can I just say, before we go any further as well, what a delight it is to be in such a kind of cafe environment. You know, nothing says to me literacy like a giant pharmacists' convention where, you know, it's like being in a cafe in Paris, really, isn't it? Just sitting here, you know, talking about stuff. With the lighting. Anyway, we'll get on with some proper grown-up writers and not some, you know, pushy twerp. And who's starting? Do I know how to start? Tracy, are you starting? Now listen, listen to Tracy, because he's won a Pulitzer Prize and he's very nice and very, very clever. He's much smarter than you. So don't you go then, oh, I don't know. Listen, he's smarter than you. All of these people are smarter than you and me. So don't go, you know, you hear me, New York Times. All right. Did I just get booed by the New York Times? Well, it's happened in print, so why not? Yeah. All right. Well, so Tracy, would you do us the honor? Tracy, everybody. Tracy.
Thank you, Craig. Good morning. Thanks a lot. After years of writing about people in places close to my New England home, closer and closer, after a while they were just down the road, I went to Haiti for a story about American soldiers. And while in Haiti, I ran into a young doctor named Paul Farmer. Eventually, I published a book called Mountains Beyond Mountains, which is about Farmer and about, thank you. It's about Paul Farmer and about the exemplary organization that he helped to found, Partners in Health. In the course of my research, I went with Farmer to Peru, Paris, Moscow, Siberia, Montreal, Chiapas, New York, and more times than I can now remember to Haiti. Collectively, those trips were like a harrowing of hell through places like Haiti's famished, deforested Central Plateau and Moscow's Central Prison and a peri-urban slum outside of Lima whose inhabitants compared it to the surface of the moon. On my travels with Farmer, he showed me more reasons for despair than I'd ever seen before or indeed imagined. And yet it was the most exhilarating experience of my life to witness what one small group of people were accomplishing in their quest to cure some of the world's most dreadful problems. Personally, I feel very lucky to have stumbled across Paul Farmer. It's made my life more interesting and I think more meaningful. I also feel lucky professionally. That chance meeting in Haiti led me to a story that I believe, rather mystically, I'd always wanted to write. And it also led me to another story, a story that is partly about effective altruism, a story like Paul Farmer's, but also very different, an intriguing and mysterious story, a horrifying and hopeful story, a story that offered me a chance to write that thing of things, a page-turner with a heart and mind. I hope I pulled it off. About 6 years ago, my wife and I went to visit Paul Farmer in his apartment at Harvard, where he was laid up after a knee operation. A young African, a protege of Farmer's named Deo Gracias, happened to be there, and as it turned out, I spent most of the time talking with Paul while my wife talked with Deo. On the ride home, she told me the rough outlines of the story that Deo had told her, and the memory of a second-hand account of Deo's memories stuck with me for several years until finally I decided that I should hear the story for myself. He was born and raised in the small and impoverished East Central African nation of Burundi. He's the son of Tutsi cowherders and farmers. He managed to excel in school and was beginning his fourth year of medical training when ethnic civil war erupted. It was a war between Hutus and Tutsis, a division too complex and strange to explain in the time I have today. The war lasted for about 12 years. It claimed several 100,000 lives, and early on it also helped to ignite the notorious genocide in Rwanda, which began, of course, in April 1994. Burundi's civil war began 6 months earlier with the assassination of its first elected president. Deo's flight started the following day when a group of militia attacked the hospital where he was working. He made a 6 months long escape on foot, first from Burundi across the border to Rwanda, then from the genocide of Tutsis in Rwanda back to Burundi, and then through a series of complex maneuverings to New York City, where he landed with $200 in his pocket, no contacts, perfect command of French and none at all of English, and an eroding dream of returning to medicine. He was so traumatized at that point that he sometimes confused past and present. He lived first in abandoned tenements in Harlem and then in Central Park, which he found more salubrious. Working as a grocery delivery boy for $15 a day, he met an ex-contemplative nun, a truly remarkable woman. I don't think I've ever enjoyed writing about anyone more, anyway. Thanks to her efforts, He was taken in by a childless American couple, and not very long afterward, improbably enough, he enrolled as an undergraduate at Columbia University. During his time of homelessness, Deo was afflicted with what he called some kind of unrealistic pride. Before heading for bed in Central Park, he would look all around to make sure no strangers were watching, because he figured that anyone who saw him entering the park at night would guess that he was homeless. When he told me about doing this, I thought of my daughter. Once, as a young teenager visiting New York, she began to cross a busy street against the light. My wife yelled at her, and in cold fury, my daughter said, "Thanks a lot, Mom, for ruining my reputation in New York City." Deo rescued himself from hopelessness and maybe even from insanity, partly through libraries and bookstores, where he would go every evening after work and look up English words and page longingly through books in English, pretending to himself that he was actually reading them. He was a quick study. At Columbia, he majored both in biochemistry and, clearly not for practical reasons, in philosophy. The book I've written about him, Strength in What Remains, is divided in two parts. In the first, I recount Deo's memories, and in the second, I depict him in the throes of those memories. I like to think that on one level, the first part of my book is simply an exciting story, a tale of survival, of despair and determination, evil and kindness. To me, Deo seems like a more universal figure than Paul Farmer. Deo is, at the outset at least, a more ordinary person, a person who, through no act of his own, is put in an extraordinary, utterly perilous situation. I can't imagine doing what either he or Paul Farmer has done, but I think most of us would be much more apt to measure ourselves against Deo, to ask what would have happened to me in his place. I hope I've reproduced some of the feeling that came over me when I first heard Deo's account of his life, that I would not have survived. I also hope that my book humanizes what, to most Westerners anyway, is a mysterious, little-known part of the world. We hear about mass slaughter in distant countries, and we imagine that murder and mayhem define those locales. Deo's story opens up one of those places into a comprehensible landscape. It also opens up a part of New York that is designed to be invisible. The service entrances of the Upper East Side, the camping sites that homeless people make in Central Park. The second part of my book recounts my journeys with Deo back to the stations of his life in New York and in Rwanda and Burundi. It strikes me as mildly ironic that I decided to leave my New England neighborhood just when I'd begun to feel too old, too fussy, too addicted to my comforts for Paul Farmer's and Deo's kind of travel. By the time I went to Africa with Deo, I had very little appetite left for all-night plane rides and none at all for riding around in what I imagined were dangerous places. On one occasion in Burundi, I found myself so spooked that I asked Deo not to take me to a certain village. Actually, I demanded that he not take me there, which is a pretty curious act for a writer, if you think about it. Before we set out for Burundi, Deo assured me that we would be very safe there. But then he also said that he'd rather I didn't take notes openly, that I should not publicly utter the names Hutu or Tutsi, and that I should never, never speak the word genocide. In fact, I think we were safe physically. Reticence about the past, I learned, is the rule in Burundi. The native language contains an interesting, perhaps uniquely economical word, gusimbra. It's a transitive verb. To gusimbra others is to remind them of something unpleasant, particularly by uttering the names of the dead. And to gusimbra someone is worse than impolite. For me, the word came to express an essential part of my experiences with Deo. Deep down, I think Strength in What Remains is about coming to terms with memory. How can a person deal with memories like Deo's, tormenting memories, memories with a distinctly ungovernable quality? This is why my book is structured as it is, the reason for its doubleness. The story I tell isn't only about memories I heard from Deo, but also about seeing him overtaken by memories, acutely overtaken in several places, including locales he hadn't seen since his escape 13 years ago, the village where he was born and raised, and the hospital where he was nearly killed at the outset of the Civil War. But Deo didn't make that trip just to show me around. My tour of his past was incidental to what he was up to in the present and the future. His story has a denouement that even now amazes me. When I first began following him around, Deo had permanent residency and was soon to become an American citizen. He didn't have to go back to Burundi. In his place, I don't think I would have gone back, especially given the fact that the first time he went home to see his family, he was nearly killed. Deo could have lived a decent, even exemplary life in the United States, as many refugees have. No one could have blamed him if he'd stayed away from Burundi, where even now hospitalized patients who can't pay their bills are detained, imprisoned essentially, without food or care. But Deo has returned continually and keeps on returning to the country that almost killed him. And amid the post-war wreckage, with the help of friends and family, he has created an organization called Village Health Works, which, among other things, has built a clinic and a public health system free to those who can't pay in a rural village, part of a beginning, Deo hopes, of a renewed Burundi. Building and staffing and supplying a clinic in a desperately poor country isn't easy. This clinic was a pile of rocks when I visited the site with Deo in the summer of 2006. By the fall of 2008, though, it was a growing public health system that, for starters, was providing food to the hungriest people in the area and clean water to all of them. And it was also a medical center with several new buildings, a professional staff, and a fully stocked pharmacy. In its first year of operation, it treated 21,000 different patients, most of them for free. There was and still is nothing like this clinic in Burundi. Nothing elsewhere in Burundi anyway. People come there for help from all over the country, and they've been coming there in staggering numbers lately because all the doctors and all the other public facilities in Burundi have been on strike. Some patients have come on week-long treks from other countries, from the Congo and Tanzania. And there have also been a few visitors who have come not for medical help, but only to look at the clinic. When Deo asked one of these travelers why he was there, the man replied, "To see America," a sentiment for us to live up to, perhaps. Deo was very young when he went through his long nightmare. Sheer courage and pluck saved him from death and despair in Burundi and New York. So, of course, did the ex-nun and the family that adopted him, and New York's libraries and bookstores and Columbia University. But when it's come to dealing with the burden of his memories, the public health system and clinic that he founded are the nearest thing to a solution. In the end, it's neither forgetting the past nor dwelling on the past that has worked for him. For him, the answer has been remembering and acting. I once asked him why he had studied philosophy at Columbia. He told me, "I wanted to understand what had happened to me." In the end, of course, he received what all students of philosophy receive, not answers, just more questions. But as I was trying to explain his effort to build a clinic, I found myself writing, Deo had discovered a way to quiet the questions he'd been asking at Columbia. That is, he saw there might be an answer for what troubled him most about the world, an answer that lay in his hands, indeed in his memory. You had to do something. Thank you.
Tracy Kidder, everybody. That also sounds a lot better than my book. Yeah, a lot better. I don't know. Gosh. Hey, hey. Our next panelist is the lovely Jeanette Walls, who wrote a book called The Glass Castle, which did okay. Has like half a gazillion copies now in print. Yeah. And as I said, I've started reading this book, and I can't tell, it's terrific. I mean, really. Now, I don't know what you're going to say about it, but it starts with a flash flood and the kids, and you're like, ah! And then it just takes you on this roller coaster ride. You put that on the cover if you want. A roller coaster ride. Yeah, that'll sell it for you. It's a roller coaster ride. I'm sorry, everybody. I'm an illiterate boob. Jeanette Walls, everybody.
If I were to say that I'm happy to be here, that would be an understatement. I am filled with joy and glee, utter ecstasy at this moment, and a teensy bit of a feeling like I've overreached myself. What Craig said was lovely about the panel all being smarter than everybody out here, but it's not true. I am just a woman with a story, but the telling of that story has changed my life. I think I've learned a lot about the world, and perhaps even some things about myself. And it's largely because of readers. And y'all here in this room are my gateway to readers, so I'm deeply honored and joyous to be standing here, and I'd like to share with you some of the things that I've learned. I actually owe readers for the topic of my next book, my forthcoming book, Half-Broke Horses. But you know, as I sat down to write my last book, The Glass Castle, I thought, why am I doing this? Why am I exposing myself to what I was certain was going to be humiliation and shame and degradation? I thought I'd have everything I wanted in this world. You know, I had a great job, I was on television, I had a flush toilet. What more could anybody want in life, you know? And I thought, if somebody can read my story and can understand what it's like to be poor, then whatever shame and embarrassment I'm about to go through will be worth it. And then I developed an even fonder hope for my book, and that was that somebody who grew up like me would read it and might get a little glimmer of hope from my story. Not long after the publication of The Glass Castle, a teacher came up to me and she said that she had a student in her class. She teaches in a tough area in northern Alabama, a real rough scrabble area. She said a young man who doesn't like books and doesn't like reading came up to her and was carrying the book around and said he enjoyed it. She said, I thought you don't enjoy books. He said, I don't. She said, I thought you don't like reading. He said, I don't like reading. And she said, but you like this book. Why is that? And he thinks for a second and he said, this here is a fine white trash story. And then the teacher paused for a second and she said, a little bit nervously, she said, I think he meant that as a compliment. But I took it as perhaps the greatest compliment the book could have possibly received. Because if a young man who thinks of himself as trash, who thinks that literature and writing and books have nothing to do with him, if he hears my story and says, hey, you know something? She's a little bit like me. That, I believe, is why we tell stories. You know, I don't tell that story to brag about my book, but to brag about the power of storytelling. And that's what everybody in this room is in the business of. We're all in the business of storytelling. And I think that sometimes we memoirists and biographers, we get a little bit of a bum rap as exhibitionists and, you know, creating a freak show, and so train wreck people stare at it. And I, especially after having spoken to readers for the last couple of years, I believe that that is not at all why we tell these stories. It's because readers are looking for an emotional connection. They're looking to find out a little bit about people who might from a distance look very different. They might be from Africa or might be from faraway Scotland. But you know, once you get inside somebody's life and we break down these external barriers and get in people's lives, understand we're all incredibly alike. And having spoken to readers around the country, you know, they have this great passion about understanding themselves, not just other people's lives, but why they are who they are. And I believe that that is why we read biographies. But as I said, the last couple of years, I gave up my day job. I used to write about celebrities, but I've been spending the last couple of years going around and talking about my book. And readers have really stunned me with their insights about my life, believe it or not. There's been a couple of times. One time I was at an event and she raised her hand and she said, why did did your mother make this particular decision? I said, I don't know. And I tried to ask my mother, and I can't get a straight answer from her, so I don't know. Somebody else in the audience raises her hand. She said, I know. I said, you do? She said, yeah, my book club discussed it. So I love book clubs. I love readers. We said, and then we had these intimate conversations about. But anyway, as I was going around talking to people, the questions I got more than any other were about my mother. People they wanted to know. For those of you who aren't familiar with my story, my mother was a college-educated woman. My mother and father, they were living on the streets for a while I was living in New York City. And people just wanted to know. Some people got my mom. Some people said, I understand your mother. But more people would say, I understand your father. He was an alcoholic. I understand the decisions he made. I do not understand why your mother made some of the decisions that she made. And the questions were never asked out of malice or nosiness. It just people had this desire to get inside somebody's head and figure things out. It's all about psychology. So that, why would your mother, who has a college education, choose to live a life where she had no electricity or running water? And sometimes I'd explain to them, well, my mother grew up on a 180,000-acre ranch, and she didn't have running water, and she didn't have electricity, and she not only survived, but it was the ideal period of her life. It was the period of her life that she most loved. And then invariably, their faces light up. They'll say, oh, I get it. And then we'd often have a really interesting conversation after that about expectations of life and about motherhood and childhood and what people want and the difference between wanting things and needing things. And usually these conversations would end with, your next book should be about your mother. And I mull that a little bit, but I've been kicking around for a topic for a new book, and I'd sort of resisted the idea of writing about Mom. I figured I already sort of, I squeezed that sponge once, why go back to it? But readers tend to be very smart, so I proposed the idea to Mom. I said, what would you think about writing this book about you? She loved the idea. Mom, bless her heart, she lives with me now, not with me because I'm not a saint, but she lives out back. It's a mobile home, but we put on airs and call it the Vinyl Cottage. But it has running water, it has electricity. Mom, I've never known her to be so happy. At first she resisted the idea of. She said, I live in the most exciting city in the world. Why would I go down and live in Virginia? That's the sticks. And I said, Mom, you live on the street. She said, I'm not some sort of mooch. I'm not going to take advantage of my daughter and my son-in-law. And I said, Mom, we're thinking of getting horses and could really use the help. And she said, I'll be right there. And, that's also taught me a lot about life. In helping people, if we can help them help themselves, not only will they be more likely to take us up on it, but they actually might surprise us and rise to the occasion. But anyway, Mom has been fabulous about telling her story. For a solid year, I went down to the Vinyl Cottage for an hour a day, and she would tell me about her life, her childhood in the 1930s and 40s in Arizona on this 180,000-acre ranch. But as she was telling me, she kept saying, this story should not be about me. It should be about my mother. My mother led the truly interesting life. And at first I resisted because I see myself as a nonfiction writer. I have no imagination. I'm no good at making things up. I tried to fictionalize the Glass Castle, and I couldn't even think of fake names for us. I used all our middle names. So I really resisted. But as I sat down to try to write Half-Broke Horses, I was trying to write it in Mom's voice. I was trying to it was going to be a biography of my mother. And I found it very difficult to capture her voice, to get inside her head. It was a sort of scary place to be. So I tried writing every other chapter one chapter from Mom's point of view and then one from my grandmother's point of view. And whenever I wrote in my grandmother's voice, it really clicked. I understand my grandmother. I knew her only for the early part of my life. She died when I was 8, but I remember her very vividly. She was a wild character, and she carried around a gun, and she'd pull it out on the drop of a hat and shoot at things, pull out her fake teeth at the drop of a hat. She was just a real character, leathery woman, I understand my grandmother, so I tried writing in her voice, and it seemed to sort of happen. And I wrote it in first person. My grandmother, she was born in a dugout. I don't mean on a baseball field. She was born on the banks of a river in 1901, and her father raised horses. He raised carriage horses. But because he was crippled, my grandmother had to do all the physical work. She was the one who actually climbed on backs of the horses. And she became a school teacher at age 15. She didn't yet have a high school diploma. It was really tough for her to get a high school education. But she was just a tough broad. She was a tough broad. And she did what it took to get by. And that was her story. And in so many ways, she's an extraordinary woman. You know, she's a true American character and lived in a time and in a way that is very unfamiliar to a lot of us today. But in another way, I think that she's the story of a lot of us. You know, I think that a lot of people will recognize themselves in this story, especially after having gone into so many parts of the country talking to people, to readers. You know, a lot of people out there really are facing tough times and are looking for somebody to relate to and somebody who they can connect with. And again, I think that that's why we write these memoirs, is to try to find somebody like this. But as I was writing, Half Broke Horses, I thought of it as initially as nonfiction because it was my grandmother's story, but because I wrote it in first person, and because there's some things that I sort of used what I would call the storyteller's license. I stapled together things that I wasn't completely sure of, used a little putty here and there. I'd originally intended to change it all back into the third person. She did this instead of I did this, and I left it in the first person, and we're calling it a true life novel. We're calling it fiction, even though it is as closely based on my grandmother as I possibly can make it. I don't know how much of it is true. My mother, who does not know my phone number, who cannot remember her own Social Security number, has an astonishing recall for details of her childhood and stories from her mother, who was an incredible storyteller. My grandmother, she was a school teacher. And she just loved to tell stories. Everything was a lesson. So these stories were told over and over again to her. And they're passed down stories. Basically, it's a family history. And I was, you know, when I was interviewing Mom, she kept on telling me, she had all these details about Arizona history and the Yumon language and how it split among the Indian tribes in 800 AD. And I was, how can she know all this stuff? And so I said, Mom, how do you know all this stuff and you can't remember your own Social Security number? She said, my Social Security number is not that interesting. So I just sort of trusted her recall for these things. But like I said, I'm still calling the book fiction. And, but it is the story of my grandmother. It's a family story as passed down. Yesterday somebody was asking me, what is my ambition? What is my hope for Half Broke Horses? What is the number that I would like for it to sell? And you know, it's an interesting question. I'd never had any ambition for the Glass Castle. I never expected it to take off the way it is. So it has just been such an unexpected blessing. But the way that it has been received, somebody asked me if it's a dream come true. It has so far exceeded anything I would have ever dared dream. And it's thanks to readers for being so open-minded and so smart about it and finding that emotional connection. And I guess that is my dream for Half Broke Horses. You know, that, in the same way that young white trash boy sort of recognized himself in the Glass Castle. My dream for Half Broke Horses is that folks out in America, you know, whatever their background, whatever their circumstances, that they will read it and recognize that they will find out something about a world that is different from theirs, but then also one that is sort of similar to their own. They will recognize their own struggles in the struggle of Lily Casey Smith. And I guess my real dream for Half Broke Horses is that one day, you know, some woman will come up to me, some woman who looks like she has herself a tough scrabble life, somebody who looks like she's struggling to make ends meet, and she'll say to me, that there is one fine, tough broad story. Thank you very much. Thank you.
That's cool. Well played. Jeanette Walls, everybody. I love the idea that telling these stories is somehow a communication. I begin to see a thread when Tracy was speaking, and then after you, Jeanette, about this idea that I have noticed that in a very small way, I mean, I live in Los Angeles, which is an awful place. I mean, it really is. Even people who live in LA will say, this is a dirt box, this is awful. But I live there. And when there's a lot of pushing and shoving and arguments and stuff on the freeway. And when I can humanize the person that's cutting me off in traffic, I don't succumb to rage. And when I'm kind of like a serial killer, I think. I think once I can make people human, I can't destroy them. You know, I can't, you know, oh, now they have personalities, I can't. It rubs the lotion on its skin. No, because now I've given it a name. And I think that there is something in that. I don't like the idea of myself being a serial killer, but I do think that as you humanize Adele and as you humanize your grandmother, and as we get to Ben, who chronicles a generation that I don't really understand, you know, and you all have to deal with this now as well. It has been said to me this week, you have to tweet more before the book. I don't know what tweeting is. I'm not part of this. This is not. I don't have a skateboard. Never mind tweeting. I don't tweet. Although before the book comes out, I'll be tweeting every day. I won't read a damn word of it, but it'll be, oh, tweety, tweet, tweet, getting out of my car, going over here. How? I mean, this is, to me, rubbish. But that's because it's not for me. It's not for me. And like, each generation that comes before, that I think that, oh, kids today, my hip hurts. And, that's not true. There are remarkable, brilliant, fascinating, odd young minds coming up all the time. And they work in a world which I'm beginning to find myself a bit of a codger. I don't understand it, you know. And so I complain and say things were better during punk rock when everybody hated each other and you knew where you stood. Kids today with their ideas and their inventing things, Gah! You know. However, Ben can humanize these people for me, and I cannot hate them. And so please welcome Ben Mesrick, everybody.
Hello, everybody. Good morning. I got to try and humanize my generation now, but I want to start off by just thanking everyone and thanking the booksellers and the BEAs for having me. Like a lot of you, I've been a book geek since I was little. My dad had a rule when we were little that we had to read 2 books a week before we were allowed to watch TV. And I was obsessed with television, so that became an obsession with books because I had to get through 2 books a week. And luckily, he counted every type of book from science fiction to anything. So I became a speed reader at about the age of 10. And I knew I wanted to be a writer from about then. At about 12, I wrote my first book, which I sent out to publishers. Hopefully nobody in this room. And I got rejected, which still led me to keep writing. And when I graduated from college, I locked myself in a room, and I wrote and I wrote and I wrote, and I wrote 9 novels in a year. And they were deep, dark stories that took place in bars in New York City because I was reading a lot of Bret Easton Ellis and Jay McInerney, and I thought that's what writers write. And consequently, I got 190 rejection slips in 1 year, and I used to tape them to my walls, and I'd sit in a room covered with rejection. But I was used to rejection. I'm a pretty geeky guy, so college was all about rejection for me. And I went from there, and I decided I'm going to keep doing this. I'm going to keep doing this. And I met an editor, actually from Random House, who said, you should read some John Grisham and then come back in a year. And so I went and I read John Grisham and I read Michael Crichton, and I said, I could do this, I could write a thriller. And my dad's a doctor, so I thought, okay, I'll write a medical thriller. So I wrote a medical thriller, and it sold, and I managed to get a second medical thriller. And these were, you know, pop thrillers. My second book was called Reaper. I don't think anybody here remembers it, and don't worry about that. And it was about a computer virus that makes the jump to the biological world, and people start getting sick from their TV sets. And that was trashy enough to end up as a TV movie starring Antonio Sabato Jr., the underwear model. Great guy. I actually was on set, and he did crunches in between his takes. And so he was in very good shape, and he played a surgeon in the movie. And I remember there's a scene where he's leaning over this patient's chest, and he goes, we've got a subdural hematoma. And I'm watching it with my dad, who's a doctor, and he says, you know that's in the head, right? And I was like, yeah. And I didn't have any power on set, which, you know. And I was a thriller writer, and that was the voice that I had found at the time. And that's where I was going to go. I had no, knowledge of nonfiction. I didn't know anything about nonfiction at the time. But I used to hang out in this bar in Boston, and the bar was called Crossroads, if any of you happen to go to Boston. And, oh yeah, there you go. Like trashy bars, I like that. It's an MIT dive bar. And there were these geeky MIT kids who used to hang out there. And they were your regular math science kids, except for, strangely enough, they had tons of money. And it was always in $100 bills. And in Boston, you never see a $100 bill. In New York, you see $100 bills. And in Vegas, they come out of the ATM machines, right? But in Boston, the last time I saw a $100 bill, can't even remember. So I went over to this kid, and I was like, why do you have so much money? And he invites me to his house. So I go over to this kid's house, and he points to his laundry, and stacked above his laundry is $250,000 in hundreds, in banded stacks. And I'm like, okay, this guy's a drug dealer. But, he didn't look like a drug dealer. And he said, no, I'm not a drug dealer. Come to Vegas. And the next day, I flew to Vegas, because I was in that part of my life. And I landed in Vegas, and 6 of his friends flew with us. And they all get out, and they pretended they didn't know each other. And we go to this suite. It was like a suite overlooking the whole strip. And the kids start to pull money out from under their clothes. And they had $1 million in cash that they had flown from Boston to Vegas with. And they pile it up on the table, and they say, we're the MIT blackjack team. And I was blown away. And I realized, I'm going to become a nonfiction writer because this is the craziest thing I've ever seen. And I joined the team, and I played with them for about 6 months. And it was a crazy experience being like the donkey boy. If any of you saw the movie 21, I was the guy who strapped $250,000 to my body and did all that stuff. And it was intense. And then it got more intense because Kevin Spacey called me about a week before the book came out. And somehow he had gotten a copy of it and said, I want to make a movie. And so then, it was made into a movie, which was really cool. And so, I was a nonfiction writer, and I had stumbled into it. And Accidental Billionaires is my new book that's coming out in July. And this book I really stumbled into as well. Like a lot of you, I love Facebook. I'm obsessed with Facebook. Actually, my wife, who's over there, is really obsessed with Facebook. And she carries the camera around, I'm embarrassing you, and takes photos. Everywhere we go, it ends up on Facebook that night. So you might all end up on Facebook tonight. But basically, I love Facebook. I had been using it, but I knew nothing about it. I knew it had started at Harvard, where I had gone to school, but I didn't know anything about it. I was sitting at home, and at 2 in the morning, I get this email to my website, and this kid goes, I'm a Harvard senior, and I've got a crazy story for you. And all writers have heard that a million times. I've got a crazy story for you. And I was like, well, I'm intrigued. What's your story? And he said, well, my best friend, co-founded Facebook. And I was like, your best friend's Mark Zuckerberg. But his best friend wasn't Mark Zuckerberg. And I thought, that's interesting. I don't know anything about it. And he said, well, come meet me for a drink. And so I go off, and I meet him for a drink in a bar. And he shows up with this geeky, gawky kid, this kid with long, stringy arms, really nice, brilliant kid. And the kid walks in and starts to tell me this insane story about he and his best friend coming up with the idea for Facebook. And I was really intrigued because I was a geeky, gawky kid at Harvard, and I knew what Harvard was like for geeky, gawky kids, and I thought this might be the next story. And I started to get deeper and deeper into it. And it is a wild, wild story. These kids were best friends, and they met. One was a sophomore and one was a junior. And they met in an underground Jewish fraternity at Harvard. There are underground fraternities at Harvard. And they were the kind of kids who really weren't getting a lot of girls. And they wanted to be cooler than they were. They were brilliant. One of them, whose name was Eduardo, was obsessed with meteorology. Weather was his thing. And he had actually come up with these mathematical equations that he could predict storms. And so during a summer, he had made a few $100,000 trading oil stocks with his brother. And so that was kind of his claim to fame at college. The other kid, whose name was Mark Zuckerberg, who a lot of people know the name, Mark was a hacker, an incredible computer scientist. The rumor was that in high school he had been on an FBI hacking list. He was that good. He had actually invented an MP3 player piece of software when he was 17 years old. that Microsoft came and offered him $1 million for, and he just turned it down and then put it online for free because he didn't really care about money. He was that kind of a kid. And the two of them were best friends, and they wanted, more people to know who they were. They wanted to meet girls. Eduardo thought the way to make it, at Harvard was to become a member of the finals clubs. Some of you might know what they are. They're kind of Harvard's answers to the Skull and Bones. They're semi-secret societies. They're 10% of the student body does them, and they're these old buildings that go back hundreds of years, and they're male only, and you join these finals clubs through a punch period where you go through these different events, and you sort of get judged all the way through, and then 10% of the student body gets in, and that's where the social center of Harvard is these finals clubs. So Eduardo thought, if I can become a member of a finals club, I could become cool. And so he went in that, and he ended up getting punched for one of them. It's called the Phoenix, which is this grand old building where I spent a lot of time researching this book. And he was slowly on his way to doing that. Now, Mark wasn't going to get into the Phoenix, and he actually went in a different route. Late at night, at about 2 in the morning, he was having a few drinks, and he decided he was going to pull a college prank. And he hacked into all of the university's computers, and he took pictures, all the pictures of every single girl on campus, and he made a sort of hot or not website. And I don't know if you remember that website, but it was a site where you could get 2 pictures of girls would come up, and you could vote on which one was hotter. And this actually, he didn't really mean to send it out, but he ended up sending it to a couple friends, and it spread. And while he was at 20,000 logs went onto that site. 20,000 people voted, and by the time he came back, it had frozen all of the campus computers. And he realized that he was in a lot of trouble, and he unplugged it very quickly, and he nearly got kicked out of school. And what was amazing about Mark was he didn't really know why he was in trouble. He didn't think that he had done anything really wrong, and in his mind he had pointed out a problem with the computer systems at Harvard, and he also didn't really understand why all the women's groups on campus were very upset at him. He had gotten letters from, it had been emailed, the link to his website had been emailed to all of the women's groups on campus, and they had freaked out about it. But he had gotten in big trouble, and he had ended up in the school paper. And when he had ended up in the school paper, he caught the attention of 2 other characters that are in this book, and they're the Winklevoss twins. And these guys come right out of a Hollywood movie. 6'5", Olympic rowing, identical twins. They're mirror image of each other. One's lefty and one's righty. And they look like Ben Affleck. I mean, they are... You walk into the room with these guys and you're like, this is crazy. These guys are like robots because they row together. They rowed in Beijing in a single boat. And they were kind of the cool kids on campus. They, were Olympic athletes. They were in a club called the Persilian, which is the ultimate finals club at Harvard. The Persilian is so secretive that women are only allowed in twice. On the day you marry them and on your 20th anniversary. And at no other time is a woman ever allowed in that building, which is pretty crazy. And these kids were members of this ultra-secret club. They were jocks. They were the cool kids on campus. And they also had an idea for a website. They were trying to make a dating website, which at the time they had called the Harvard Connection, which ended up being called Connect You. And they needed a geek because they didn't know how to computer program that well. And so they basically saw Mark Zuckerberg in the newspaper and said, we're going to hire this kid as a geek. Now, I want to preface it by saying, when you meet these kids, they are the nicest guys in the world, and they're very self-aware. I remember walking into the room with them, and they said, I know you're looking at us and thinking we're the bad guys. Because if this were an 80s movie, we would be dressed as skeletons chasing the Karate Kid around the party. Because we're the big, blonde, good-looking guys. But in their mind, they're not the bad guys. They hired Mark Zuckerberg to code their website. Anyways, about a week later, Mark Zuckerberg and Eduardo were sitting having lunch, and they were thinking about the whole incident with the college prank that went bad and how they hadn't gotten kicked out of school very luckily. And they thought to themselves, well, what if girls could put their own pictures up? And so you weren't stealing their pictures. The girls could put their own pictures up, and then I could go and look at the girls and make connections with them. And they basically had the idea of Facebook right there. They thought, what if we let people have their own control and put their own photos up? And so they said, okay, we're going to do this. So Mark basically locked himself in a room and for about a week programmed and launched Facebook. Eduardo put in $1,000, which is what they needed to rent the servers, and Facebook was launched. And very quickly, it pretty much exploded. When Facebook first started, you had to have a Harvard EDU. You had to have a Harvard computer address to log on, because the idea was they were going to make their own finals club. It would be just as exclusive as the Porcellian or the Phoenix, but it would be online. So you had to be a Harvard student. Within about 2 weeks, everyone at Harvard was logged on. 5,000 people were logged on. About a month later, they decided to start moving it around from other Ivy League schools, and very shortly there were 20,000 members, and it was moving very, very quickly, and it got to Stanford. And Stanford, you know, was a hotbed of Silicon Valley. A lot of young people were there, and this is where a kid named Sean Parker comes into the story. Sean Parker is the craziest person I've ever met. He's brilliant, a genius. When he was 17, he was in high school, and he co-founded Napster with his buddy Sean Fanning. When he was about 20, 21, he founded Plaxo. He ended up getting kicked out of Plaxo, and he was looking for the next billion-dollar idea. And he was basically lying in a dorm-like room when he saw a laptop computer that had the Facebook screen on it. And he thought, this might be my next billion-dollar idea. So he flew out to Cambridge. He ended up meeting up with Mark Zuckerberg and Eduardo, and he said, I'm going to try and take this to the next level. And the rest is kind of history. It went from there, and it went from 20,000 members to 100,000 members to 500,000 members, all the way to 1 million members. And things started to fray between the two best friends. Eduardo and Mark, I mean, they were two kids in a dorm room when they came up with the idea. Mark went off to California, to Silicon Valley, and started to really work on the idea. Eduardo went to New York to sell ads for the idea, and there was sort of a falling out. By the time Facebook reached 1 million members, the two kids became enemies and were no longer friends. Eduardo kind of vanished from Facebook's history, and only about a month ago was he reinstated as co-founder, which may have something to do with this book coming out and may not. But it was a really intense process getting inside of it. I mean, I know everyone in the world uses Facebook and everyone loves it, but not everyone knows that it was really founded by the two most socially awkward, geeky kids at Harvard who really couldn't meet girls and couldn't be social, and it's ironic that they created the next revolution in society, and it's the biggest social network in the world, the biggest picture site in the world, the biggest everything in the world, and it's just going to keep getting bigger. And we are working on a movie. It's actually going very quickly. Aaron Sorkin did the screenplay, and a brilliant man. It was an odd experience. Normally you write the book and you send it out and then someone adapts it. He was adapting it while I wrote it. We would sit in a hotel room in Boston and basically trade information back and forth, which was a wild experience. Kevin Spacey is co-producing it with Scott Rudin, and it's with Sony Pictures, and that's going to move along very nicely. So it's going to be fun. Hopefully it'll be out soon, and the book comes out in July. It's called Accidental Billionaires, and I just want to thank you all very much for having me. Thank you.
That pretty much concludes our panel this morning. I realize, though, just there that I am doomed to financial failure because of my ability to converse with women, who I'd much rather have in the room with me. That's right, I'm lecherous old school. I thank you for coming. I realize that I haven't said the name of my own book, which will cause a great deal of consternation down there. So it's called American on Purpose, and I'm proud of it. I'm honored to have spent the morning with these delightful, talented people, and thank you, and thank you for including me in this wonderful event. Have fun, and I'll see you at the booth. Don't dare talk to anyone before they're at the booth. Don't talk to people before the booth. It's like the new Fight Club thing. Don't talk to people until they're at the booth. Thank you, and good morning, everyone.